For 5 relentless seasons of aerial phenomena, underground discoveries, sudden crew hospitalizations, and instrument readings that shattered conventional physics, one rule remained absolute. The gates of Skinwalker Ranch stayed open. Brandon Fugal, the real estate tycoon and driving force behind the modern investigation, built his entire operation on an unwavering commitment to continuation. Where others broke, Fugal pushed forward. But that streak of absolute resilience came to a sudden halt when external scientists brought onto the property confirmed a chilling reality, one so profound that it forced a lockdown decision completely unprecedented in the history of the ranch. To understand the weight of this sudden lockdown, one has to understand the legacy of failure Fugal inherited when he purchased the infamous property from aerospace billionaire Robert Bigelow in 2016. Every serious entity that had ever attempted to decode Skinwalker Ranch eventually hit a wall where moving forward became impossible. The original Sherman family was driven to psychological and financial ruin by terrifying localized phenomena. The National Institute for Discovery Science encountered intense bureaucratic roadblocks and an elusive entity that seemed to actively evade their censors. Even the Pentagon-funded Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications program eventually saw its government funding discontinued amidst institutional resistance. Whether due to financial pressure, official pushback, or the unique, draining dread that sustained proximity to the ranch inflicts on the human psyche, every previous program eventually stopped. Fugal entered the venture fully aware of this history, but instead of viewing the failures of the past as a warning, he treated them as a blueprint to build something far more durable. He engineered a multi-layered investigative ecosystem designed specifically to outlast whatever the phenomenon could throw at them. He secured a major television broadcast deal to insulate the project from sudden financial collapse, anchored his scientific team with Dr. Travis Taylor's high-level aerospace and defense research credentials, and deployed a continuous, multi-spectrum surveillance infrastructure that gave the investigation a permanent presence prior programs had never sustained. For years, this design proved invincible, absorbing blows that would have shut down any ordinary operation within its first months. The gates stayed wide open when a crew member suffered a mysterious neurological injury requiring emergency medical evacuation. The gates stayed open when heavy drilling rigs struck an impenetrable, non-geological barrier at depths perfectly matching sonar-mapped underground voids. The gates even stayed open when 4 independent, unhackable perimeter cameras documented a massive, cloaked signature breaching the property line from the outside. Through high radiation spikes, equipment failures, and psychological warfare, the directive remained the same: keep moving. But the breaking point finally arrived, and it did not come from internal telemetry or the regular research team's equipment. The confirmation that finally brought the hammer down came from independent, outside scientists brought in to audit the property's most extreme anomalies. Their definitive findings did not just indicate another transient light in the sky, or a fleeting electromagnetic spike. They confirmed a reality so severe that it directly threatened the investigation's continuation. For a man whose entire identity is defined by a refusal to stop, Brandon Fugal's decision to lock down the property isn't just a safety protocol. It stands as an admission that the team has finally crossed a line, turning a lockdown into the most significant and chilling event in the modern history of Skinwalker Ranch. The external scientists were brought onto the property for one specific reason: to assess a massive body of data that Travis Taylor determined required independent validation before any conclusions could be responsibly drawn. Usually, Taylor's professional standards meant anomalous findings were subjected to strict internal analysis before anyone else ever saw them. The fact that this specific data was immediately referred to outside experts meant that whatever the internal analysis had uncovered was so profound and so potentially disruptive that Taylor's scientific discipline demanded independent verification before he would even act on it. The outside experts represented 3 distinct disciplines, a combination that was highly deliberate rather than coincidental. First was a geophysicist whose academic background focused on unusual electromagnetic propagation through subsurface geological formations. Second was a physicist specializing in directed energy systems, a man whose professional history included classified defense research operating in the exact same technical domain as several of Taylor's past NASA projects. Finally, there was a materials scientist whose laboratory had already conducted confidential, independent analysis on physical samples recovered from the ranch's active zones. Compositional results that had never been publicly disclosed on any broadcast. To ensure the findings were completely insulated from the institutional bias and conventional dismissal, that typically plagues the ranch, Taylor designed a blind assessment framework. The instrument data was stripped entirely of its geographic and contextual history. The scientists were forced to evaluate the readings as raw data, completely unaware of where it had been collected. What they confirmed when looking at that raw data, long before they were told they were staring at measurements from Skinwalker Ranch, is what ultimately triggered the lockdown. The data Taylor submitted for this blind audit represented the accumulation of the investigation's most recent readings across 3 specific measurement categories, focusing heavily on the underground dimension of the phenomenon. Specifically, the longitudinal electromagnetic data from the Mesa zone covered a period of continuous monitoring so dense and prolonged that it possessed a statistical foundation transient anomalies could never claim. What this dataset revealed was not a series of random spikes that eventually returned to a normal baseline, the typical pattern of a passing environmental event. Instead, it showed a clear, terrifying directional movement. The baseline itself was steadily rising, proving that whatever forces were active beneath the ranch were actively gaining strength. The electromagnetic environment of the Mesa zone had evolved into something measurably and consistently different from what it was at the beginning of the monitoring period. Worse, the rate of that change was actively accelerating across the most recent measurement sessions. When the geophysicist brought in for the external assessment reviewed these numbers, her reaction was captured in the internal record with a specific quality of professional restraint, the distinct tone of a scientist choosing her words with extreme caution when confronted by an extraordinary finding. Adding a chilling second dimension to the assessment package was the underground vibration data from the drilling zone. The vibration signatures, logged by sensitive sensors positioned at the boundaries of the ranch's subterranean void network, had begun showing a fundamental shift in their structural characteristics. It wasn't their frequency range that had changed. That remained consistent with the established baseline. Instead, the change was in their internal organization. The randomness metric applied to those deep signatures was steadily declining. The patterns echoing from beneath the earth were becoming less random over time, progressing with a statistical significance that the outside assessment confirmed as undeniably real, and for which the geophysicist could provide no conventional explanation. The third data stream was the one Dr. Travis Taylor had been most careful about in every public reference to the current investigation phase, the thermal anomaly documentation from the perimeter monitoring network. Across the recent recording period, this documentation revealed a disturbing shift in both the frequency and proximity of anomalous thermal signatures at the ranch boundary. The signatures were appearing more often, they were appearing closer to the fence line, and they were moving in the exact coordinated spatial distributions that prior analysis had identified as the behavioral signature of the phenomenon. Upon reviewing these precise tracking patterns, and still completely unaware of the data's origin, the materials scientist noted that the distributions were entirely inconsistent with any known animal behavior pattern in any terrestrial ecosystem she had ever encountered. Ultimately, it was the geophysicist's cross-examination of the underground data that produced what Taylor later described in limited internal communications as the most technically significant result of the entire external audit. Thanks to her specialized background in electromagnetic propagation through subsurface geological formations, she possessed the precise analytical framework to read the Mesa zone's data in a way that previous surface geology and mining consultants simply couldn't. When she overlaid the subterranean electromagnetic readings with the vibration signatures from the underground sensor network, she discovered a terrifying mathematical truth that the internal team had suspected but could never fully characterize. The two data streams were not independent of one another. Their variations were perfectly undeniably correlated. The Earth wasn't just shifting, and the energy wasn't just spiking. They were operating in tandem, moving together as part of a single, unified, and awakening system. Specific changes in the electromagnetic data were consistently and predictably followed by specific changes in the vibration data. The mathematical structure of this relationship followed a rigid pattern that the geophysicist's analysis characterized not as two independent anomalies occurring in the same space, but as a single coupled system. In physics, a coupled system is one in which distinct components interact so deeply that the state of one directly influences and dictates the state of the other. The electromagnetic environment and the physical vibrations deep beneath the Skinwalker Ranch Mesa were behaving exactly like this. Whatever was generating the surging energy signals was hardwired to whatever was causing the Earth to vibrate. They were two expressions of the exact same subterranean mechanism. The geophysicist's characterization of what that mechanism might actually be was captured in the internal record with the most carefully chosen language of the entire audit. She stated that the coupled system's behavior was entirely consistent with a mechanism responding directly to an external input. By cross-referencing the exact timing correlations between the system state changes and surface-level events, she identified the most likely catalyst, the team's own drilling operation. The underground system was actively responding to the drilling. Its reactions were not random, uncoordinated echoes. They were structured, directional, and escalating in a manner she described as a system rapidly approaching a critical threshold state. What would happen once that threshold was crossed, she flatly declined to speculate. She merely confirmed with mathematical certainty that the system was accelerating toward it. This was the terrifying reality the physicist specializing in directed energy systems stepped into, bringing a professional framework that no prior consultant on the property had ever possessed. His background in classified defense research, specifically the development, deployment, and detection of systems that utilize focused electromagnetic radiation as weaponized or operational instruments, gave him a precise reference vocabulary for the Mesa zone data that the internal team had been sorely lacking. Where others saw chaotic anomalous static, his eyes, trained by military-grade defense projects, saw the distinct deliberate signatures of technology. What the defense physicist said about the signal before learning its geographic origin is what ultimately moved Brandon Fugal from a state of deep concern to immediate, decisive action. After analyzing the frequency range, internal structure, directional propagation pattern, and the exact relationship between the signal's amplitude and its spatial distribution, the physicist reached a staggering conclusion. The data was consistent with an intentionally generated, artificial signal rather than a naturally occurring anomaly. In his professional assessment, this wasn't just a loose possibility, it was the most technically supportable interpretation of the data. Naturally occurring electromagnetic signals generated by geological friction, atmospheric shifts, or other environmental sources simply do not possess this kind of internal structure. Geological signatures are inherently broadband and chaotic, while atmospheric emissions are highly variable and dependent on external weather conditions. The data recorded by the Mesa zone instruments had neither of those traits. It possessed all the hallmarks of a signal that was deliberately designed. Because of his history with classified directed energy defense applications, the physicist had spent a career recognizing the specific technical signatures of intentionally generated, focused radiation. Applying that exact framework to the Mesa data, he stated with clinical precision that the subterranean signal bore the operational hallmarks of a directed energy system, but one operating in a frequency range and with an internal complexity that no human technology in existence was capable of producing. It wasn't just advanced. It was beyond the demonstrated capability of any defense program he had ever had clearance to know about. This absolute confirmation from a top-tier defense insider became the exact foundation upon which the total lockdown was ordered. Ironically, the materials scientist's role in this external audit was initially expected to be the most peripheral, a simple supplementary validation of physical samples rather than a primary driver of the investigation. What her analysis actually produced shook the team to its core. Years prior, her laboratory had conducted blind testing on physical samples recovered from the ranch's active zones under the same strict anonymity protocols used for the project's biological and DNA testing. The ranch had kept her bizarre compositional findings strictly confidential, hidden away in their internal files. But this joint assessment gave her full access to the investigation's complete physical evidence documentation for the very first time. For the first time, she was able to contextualize her old laboratory results against the live instrument data the other two scientists were actively dissecting, weaving a third terrifying thread into an undeniable picture. What that contextualization produced was a revelation that would haunt the materials scientist long after she left the property. As she layered her previous laboratory findings over the fresh data, she realized that the physical evidence from the ranch's active zones, the bizarre compositional anomalies in materials recovered from areas of intense electromagnetic activity, the erratic thermal properties of objects found near the subterranean voids, and the unexplainable structural characteristics of the recovered samples, perfectly aligned with the raw power of the signal. They were consistent with the exact type of material transformation that the directed energy physicist's assessment would predict. A system operating in that specific frequency range, and at the immense intensity suggested by the Mesa data, would inevitably leave behind specific, identifiable scars on any physical matter within its operational field. The materials scientist found those exact signatures written directly into the physical evidence. This correlation was not incidental. It was concrete, physical proof that the subterranean signal was real, that it was operating at a terrifyingly high intensity, and that it had been actively warping the physical environment of the ranch for an unknowable length of time. In fact, the oldest samples recovered by the team showed material degradation just as advanced as the most recent ones. Whatever was generating that artificial signal had been doing so long before Fugal ever purchased the land, and long before human cameras began rolling. Her contribution to the audit effectively welded the data to reality, proving that the digital readings and the physical modifications were documenting the exact same ancient awakening phenomenon. These combined undeniable findings were presented to Brandon Fugal in a formal assessment summary at the end of the evaluation period. Those present described a meeting with an atmosphere unlike any prior review session in the history of the ranch. It wasn't because the findings were a total surprise. Both Fugal and Dr. Travis Taylor had sensed the ominous direction the data was pointing before they ever commissioned the audit. Rather, it was because having these conclusions validated by 3 independent, world-class scientists from the outside mainstream stripped away the last remaining buffer of plausible deniability. They could no longer treat this as a series of anomalous flukes. They had to treat it as a confirmed reality. Fugal did not respond immediately. Witnesses described him sitting in absolute silence for an extended period, meticulously reviewing the combined findings before uttering a word. When he finally spoke, his first concern was not about the groundbreaking science, the historical implications, or the television production. It was about the people on the property. He spoke of the crew members, the technical team, and the production staff, everyone whose daily presence on the ranch constituted an ongoing active exposure to a force that the outside assessment had just confirmed was operating at a scale and with an intentionality that none of their existing safety protocols were ever designed to handle. The lockdown decision followed directly from that immediate human concern, rather than from the staggering scientific implications of what the assessment had confirmed. While those technical implications were significant enough to occupy the team's analytical attention for years to come, the immediate practical question was whether the people currently working on the property were doing so with an adequate understanding of the environment they were truly standing in. Fugal's answer to that question was a definitive no, and his response to that answer was to shut it all down. The gates were closed. The active investigation was abruptly suspended. The subsequent communication to the History Channel, the very message that produced the public acknowledgement of the lockdown, was delivered with the absolute directness of a man who has spent a decade carefully measuring his words. Fugal decided that the massive audience the investigation had built across 5 seasons deserved to be told the unvarnished truth. A lockdown at Skinwalker Ranch is not merely a pause. It is not a clever production break or a scheduled hiatus in the operational calendar. The investigation Brandon Fugal has run since 2016 has never had a scheduled hiatus. The continuous monitoring infrastructure runs perpetually, whether an active research team is on site or not, feeding a nonstop research agenda. Instead, this lockdown represents a fundamental paradigm-shifting reassessment of the relationship between the investigation and the phenomenon it is studying. It is a total retreat driven by independent proof that the phenomenon is operating at a scale, with a technical sophistication, and with an acute awareness of the team's activity that their existing safety frameworks were completely blind to. While the exact operational changes remain shielded from the public domain, it is known that the active research team's physical presence on the property has been suspended pending the development of entirely new, heavily revised protocols. The physical infrastructure of the ranch is undergoing a massive overhaul. The current monitoring equipment safety specifications are being aggressively reevaluated against the raw signal intensity confirmed by the defense physicist, and the crew's medical and exposure histories are being cross-examined against the materials scientists' terrifying findings regarding physical transformation effects. For the millions who have followed this journey across 5 seasons, the significance of this moment requires no explanation. The man who refused to stop for anything has finally halted. In their attempt to study the mystery beneath the Mesa, the team didn't just look into the abyss. The abyss noticed them back, and Brandon Fugal chose to lock the gates before it was too late. Brandon Fugal had never closed the gates before. Through years of escalating high-strung tension, he had never suspended the active investigation for any reason whatsoever. The fact that he chose to do so now, in direct response to a scientific assessment whose findings he decided to characterize publicly rather than manage behind closed doors, communicated something far more significant than any technical jargon or data points ever could. It signaled that whatever has been operating beneath and around Skinwalker Ranch is officially confirmed to be an entity or force that requires an entirely different, far more cautious approach. This public admission stands as the most transparent, honest moment the investigation has produced across 5 seasons, and it demands attention. Every single program that has ever attempted to untangle the mystery of Skinwalker Ranch eventually reached a breaking point and stopped. The Sherman family fled after being pushed to the brink. ENIDS wound down its operations. AAWSA classified its findings and went entirely quiet. What always set Fugal apart was his absolute refusal to halt until now. Yet, this lockdown is not a failure of the investigation. It is its most profound moment of truth. It is the exact point where the man who built the most sophisticated private research operation in history looked at the undeniable evidence verified by 3 independent scientists and realized that blindly charging forward without acknowledging the danger would be a foolish kind of courage. The signal beneath the Mesa is real, it is intentional, it is actively escalating, and it has been warping the property since long before humans began keeping records. Fugal locked the gates because the science demanded it, saying out loud what every previous program encountered but chose to hide. This shifts the entire paradigm of the investigation. For the first time, the team will approach the property knowing exactly what they are dealing with, changing the nature of everything that comes next. Fugal had never evacuated Skinwalker Ranch. Through 5 seasons of baffling aerial phenomena, underground voids, sudden crew hospitalizations, and instrument readings that systematically dismantled conventional physics, the operation kept moving. That is, until the drilling operation reached a depth where it didn't just meet physical resistance, it triggered a direct, calculated response. Fugal's entire ownership has been defined by this single, unwavering commitment to continuation. Where the Shermans hit the absolute limit of what a family could endure and sold the land, and where Robert Bigelow's ENIDS program eventually exhausted its institutional patience and private funding, Fugal designed an ecosystem explicitly engineered to outlast those exact pressures. He built an infrastructure to withstand the financial strain, the institutional skepticism, the personal toll, and the unique, draining dread that sustained exposure to the ranch inflicts on the human psyche. His monitoring grid runs perpetually, and his scientific team possesses the high-level defense credentials to weather any mainstream pushback. He had built a fortress of science designed to never stop moving, only for a deliberate subterranean echo to prove that the phenomenon was not just a passive anomaly to be observed, but an active participant waiting to respond. The broadcast format Brandon Fugal chose gave the modern investigation a level of public accountability that prior private programs never had. Every single design decision was oriented toward the exact same outcome, keeping the research moving forward regardless of what the ranch produced. For 5 intense seasons, that commitment was tested constantly. The team faced aerial phenomena that defied every known principle of aerodynamics, underground structures whose stark geometric consistency defied any natural geological model, and crew members whose emergency medical evacuations documented severe physical injuries that attending physicians could not attribute to any known environmental cause. Through it all, including highly troubling instrument readings that forced Dr. Travis Taylor to choose his public words, with the absolute care of a physicist aware of his data's terrifying implications, the operation kept moving. The evacuation marks the absolute first time in 5 seasons of intense investigation that the team decided to stop, not to pause, not to briefly suspend a single session, but to entirely evacuate the property. What produced that unprecedented decision was whatever the drilling operation finally reached. The machine didn't just strike a physical barrier. Whatever was waiting in the deep darkness responded to being reached in a way that made evacuation the only responsible choice. The drilling operation was the investigation's most direct, aggressive attempt to physically access the underground formation that the sonar and ground-penetrating radar work of the middle seasons had established as the property's most significant and anomalous feature. The early sonar returns from beneath the mesa had produced the investigation's first clear picture of the subterranean environment, identifying massive, highly structured voids. The geometry of these spaces was entirely inconsistent with natural cave formations. They were too uniform in their proportions, too regular in their arrangement, and located precisely beneath the surface zones of maximum electromagnetic anomalies to be accounted for by standard geological dissolution. This drilling operation was engineered to close the gap between instrument-based mapping and the hard physical reality of what lay beneath the Earth. Over multiple seasons, the team had developed a highly progressive approach methodology. They utilized precise lateral entry angles to avoid the direct vertical descents, whose crushing mechanical resistance had abruptly terminated earlier drilling efforts. They conducted meticulous geological assessments to pinpoint the formation boundary zones where penetration was most viable, and they utilized real-time instrument monitoring to track the subterranean formation's reaction to the equipment. Each successive season's iteration brought them closer to the anomalous structures. The resistance the formation generated in response to those prior drilling attempts had always been the team's most consistent evidence that whatever was resting underground was not indifferent to the human activity above it. The project was plagued by severe equipment failures occurring at highly specific, repetitive depths, failures whose subsequent mechanical analyses produced absolutely no conventional explanation. Yet previous operations had treated these mechanical breakdowns as passive roadblocks to be engineered around. This time, however, the phenomenon shifted from passive resistance to an active, calculated response, changing the nature of the entire investigation in a single, terrifying moment. The sensor arrays positioned at the boundaries of the underground void network registered a profound structural shift that extended far beyond simple energy readings. The deep, low-frequency acoustic vibrations that had quietly echoed beneath the property for years suddenly locked into a rhythmic, mathematically precise cadence. The randomness metric that the team used to track subterranean activity plummeted to near zero, indicating that the Earth below was no longer settling or shifting under natural geological weight. It was organizing. It was behaving with the rigid, unmistakable symmetry of a machine being primed for activation. As the heavy drill steel ground deeper into the mesa, cutting through the boundary layer toward the sonar-mapped anomaly, the atmosphere on the surface grew thick with tangible tension. Travis Taylor and the engineering crew watched the telemetry screens in the command center as the drill bit closed the final remaining distance. They had anticipated the mechanical kickback, the sudden torque spikes, or the unexplainable flooding that had thwarted their path in previous seasons. They were prepared for the ranch to fight back. Instead, the moment the drill bit breached the threshold of the primary subterranean structure, the mechanical stress on the rig completely vanished. The torque dropped to near zero, and the drill spun freely, as if it had slipped out of solid stone and into an impossibly vast, empty chamber. That was the exact moment the phenomenon stopped resisting and delivered its true response. Instantly, the entire multi-spectrum monitoring grid across the ranch ignited. It didn't just crash or short out as it had in the past. The equipment was hijacked by a massive, outbound surge of directed energy. Thermal imaging cameras trained on the sky above the mesa captured immense, geometrically perfect columns of cold air plunging downward, while simultaneously, localized radiation detectors began chirping in a synchronized, escalating chorus. The perimeter sensors logged a sudden, dense clustering of anomalous thermal signatures that materialized right at the fence line, moving in a coordinated, sweeping formation that completely surrounded the active drilling zone. The raw data streaming into the command center matched the terrifying blueprint previously identified by the defense physicist and the materials scientist. The underground coupled system had received its catalyst, and it was accelerating toward a critical threshold state at a blinding rate. The energy wasn't just spiking, it was radiating outward with an intensity that threatened to permanently alter the physical matter of everything and everyone in its operational field. Realizing that their safety protocols were entirely obsolete against a phenomenon that was now actively and intelligently responding to their presence, Brandon Fugal made the call. The drilling was aborted, the engines were cut, and for the first time in 5 seasons of relentless investigation, the entire team evacuated the property, leaving the awakening entity beneath the mesa alone in the desert silence. The vibration signatures from the underground sensors had been showing a repeating, rhythmic structure whose mechanical precision was entirely inconsistent with any natural geological process known to science. Simultaneously, the perimeter monitoring data revealed an undeniable match to the entry vectors established in the team's prior sweeps. Whatever was operating across the broader Uinta Basin was actively condensing its presence, narrowing its focus down to the exact patch of earth where the drilling rig was clawing downward. The session began with the ranch's full monitoring infrastructure deployed at absolute maximum capacity. Every instrument was live, every camera unit was aimed, and the entire scientific team was glued to the real-time telemetry streaming from the sensors closest to the drill. Within the first hour, the instruments lit up with what the technical field notes would categorize as the most concentrated, simultaneous multi-category anomaly the investigation had ever recorded. Individually, these weren't the highest peak values ever logged. Past experiments had seen greater single spikes of radiation or radio interference. What made this terrifying was the perfect alignment. Every single instrument category elevated at the exact same moment, mapping a distinct geographic web that centered perfectly on the drilling rig's physical coordinates. It wasn't a random environmental reaction. Something was paying direct, focused attention to exactly where the drill was cutting. And then, the bit hit the target depth. The drill breached the precise upper boundary of the primary void structure, the massive geometric cavern that sonar and radar mapping had long identified as the beating heart of the Mesa's anomalies. This was the exact feature whose unnatural proportions and direct alignment with surface anomalies had made it the ultimate target of multiple seasons of planning. What happened the moment the machinery pierced that threshold is what Dr. Travis Taylor, speaking with the rigid discipline and clinical restraint of a defense physicist, characterized as unlike anything the infrastructure had ever witnessed. The machine did not strike a harder rock layer. It didn't seize or flood. Instead, the void responded. The mechanical telemetry from the rig suddenly registered a complete structural inversion, and the subterranean sensors documented an outbound wave of energy that felt less like a physical displacement and more like a deliberate, system-wide acknowledgement of their intrusion. The mathematical patterns in the Earth didn't just escalate. They locked into a state of absolute, undeniable feedback, transforming the site from a passive archaeological dig into a live, reactive grid that left the team with only one responsible defensive option: kill the power, drop the tools, and abandon the property before the threshold crossed a point of no return. The electromagnetic readings across the monitoring network did not spike in the escalating resistance pattern the prior sessions had established as the formation's typical response to a drilling approach. Instead, they shifted simultaneously across every single sensor in the entire network. In a terrifying flash, the geographic distribution of the energy morphed from a locally concentrated anomaly into a massive basin-wide elevation captured by the network's full geographic extent all at once. The monitoring data proves the sheer, unnatural speed of this transition. It occurred entirely between consecutive data points in the digital recording. The phenomenon was present in one localized configuration in one data frame and completely blanketed the entire basin in the very next frame, leaving absolutely no transitional period between the two states. Simultaneously, the acoustic sensors registered this transition in the deep infrasound range. The readings abruptly shifted from a repeating temporal structure into a single, massive, sustained signal. The internal structure and frequency of this deep hum were so anomalous that the team's audio specialist characterized it in real time as unlike anything ever documented in the ranch's extensive acoustic record. At the exact same moment, the ground vibration sensors logged a massive signature at the target depth. This was not the mechanical vibration of drilling equipment grinding against unforgiving geological strata. The analysis characterized the vibration as emanating directly from within the void structure itself, rather than from the rock surrounding it. It was a signature perfectly consistent with a large-scale physical event detonating inside the underground cavern the moment the drill bit kissed its boundary. The fact that this event occurred in perfect temporal alignment with the drill reaching the threshold is exactly why the team labeled it a calculated response rather than standard resistance. The next 11 minutes, the precise window between the drill bit breaching the target depth and Brandon Fugal making the historic decision to evacuate, are fully documented across every instrument category and every camera unit running on the property. What those 11 minutes contain: the terrifying cascade of data on the screens, the palpable shifting of the physical environment on the property, and the raw panic of the research team experiencing it firsthand, formed the undeniable body of evidence that forced Fugal's hand. In his limited public references to the event, Fugal has openly stated that the character of those 11 minutes was entirely unlike anything witnessed in 5 seasons of investigating the most anomalous piece of land in American history. The electromagnetic shift that occurred when the drill bit pierced the target depth did not stabilize in its new basin-wide configuration. It continued to mutate. Instead of receding toward the prior localized distribution, the energy moved further and further away from it, the basin-wide elevation ruthlessly mounting in intensity across the entire monitoring network. The technical team's real-time analysis characterized this directional movement as actively accelerating rather than leveling off toward a new equilibrium. Whatever the drilling had triggered was not a fleeting one-time reaction. It was building momentum. Up on the surface, the thermal monitoring network documented an unprecedented temperature anomaly developing in the Mesa zone in the immediate minutes following the breakthrough. The ambient thermal environment across the entire surface of the Mesa began to rise, charting an elevation whose magnitude and geographic footprint were completely without precedent in the ranch's extensive history. The Mesa was actively warming from within. The change was not wildly dramatic. The differential was technically measurable, rather than immediately perceptible to the skin of the researchers standing out in the desert air, but it blanketed the entire stone formation. The mathematical pattern was entirely consistent with a massive transmission of heat radiating from below, indicating that something in the deep underground structure had fundamentally altered its thermal state the exact second the drill breached its boundary. Yet, it was the physical effects on the team members standing at the dig site during those 11 minutes that became the most guarded element of the evacuation record. Multiple crew members simultaneously began reporting physical symptoms whose onset and timing corresponded perfectly with the electromagnetic surge and the warming of the Mesa. These were not the acute, violent medical emergencies that had historically plagued the crew in earlier seasons. Instead, they were subtle, creeping sensations that gripped multiple individuals at the exact same moment, steadily gaining intensity as the clock ticked down. Having spent 5 years accumulating data on how the ranch's active zones warped the human biology, Fugal possessed the precise, harrowing context needed to recognize this progression. He knew exactly what it meant, and he knew he had to act before the symptoms spiraled out of control. When the clock hit the 11-minute mark of the post-breakthrough window, Brandon Fugal made the historic call to evacuate. The decision was not born out of a formal consultation process, a committee review, or a careful debate over the incoming telemetry. It was made by Fugal directly, barked to the field team immediately, and executed without a single shred of the deliberation that had typically characterized major operational changes in the past. The sheer speed of his response reflected a profound realization in a man who had spent 5 seasons building a reference framework for this property. Fugal's entire track record was built on a consistent public judgment that the investigation should always advance toward whatever the ranch generated, rather than fleeing from it. He was the man who kept the gates open through radiation, cloaked anomalies, and hospitalizations. But in those 11 minutes, his framework told him something undeniable. The investigation was no longer operating within conditions it was equipped to manage, and the only way to save his team was to retreat. He had made that heavy judgment time and again in the face of crew medical emergencies, shattered equipment, bizarre aerial encounters, and violent underground resistance. The cumulative weight of those past crises had always been absorbed, documented, and overridden by the ironclad mandate to keep moving. What changed during the 11 minutes following the drill's breakthrough? The core truth that made the evacuation decision fundamentally different from any other choice in the investigation's history came down to one terrifying distinction: direction. Every prior decision to push forward was made under the assumption that the phenomenon was merely producing its anomalous outputs near the team, existing as a localized, ambient mystery occurring around them. But the 11 minutes after the drill bit pierced the subterranean void shattered that assumption. The monitoring data and the direct, creeping physical sensations felt by the crew established that this energy was not ambient. It was targeted. The instantaneous basin-wide electromagnetic shift, the uniform warming of the Mesa's stone surface, the simultaneous onset of physical symptoms across multiple individuals, and the relentless intensification of every metric over that 11-minute window all pointed to a single conclusion. The source of the anomaly was acutely aware of exactly where the drilling rig was, what it was doing, and was aiming its output in direct retaliation. Fugal evacuated because the investigation was no longer just observing a strange environment. They had actively provoked an intelligence that was now looking back at them. The only responsible reaction to a phenomenon that has explicitly demonstrated an awareness of your presence is to pull back, lock the gates, and meticulously analyze what you have documented before you dare to touch that trigger again. Dr. Travis Taylor's exhaustive analysis of that 11-minute data packet has since become the scientific bedrock upon which the investigation's new understanding is being built. His subsequent characterization of these findings stands as the most staggering, significant scientific disclosure regarding Skinwalker Ranch since his arrival on the property. Taylor applied his full, rigorous Defense Insider methodology to the session data, the systematic, ruthless elimination of every possible conventional explanation before even entertaining an unconventional one. Over 5 seasons, this disciplined approach had steadily chipped away at the skeptical arguments of mainstream science, but the data from this drilling session completely broke the model. When analyzing the electromagnetic shift, Taylor reached a conclusion that he has since delivered in the most unvarnished direct language he has ever applied to a piece of evidence. The simultaneous, total reconfiguration of the entire basin-wide monitoring grid in the microsecond interval between consecutive data points is completely impossible under any known law of physics. There is no electromagnetic propagation mechanism in any physical literature that can explain how an entire basin's energy baseline can completely rewrite its geometry in a single instantaneous digital frame. It didn't travel across space. It simply changed state everywhere at once. Electromagnetic fields simply do not reorganize instantaneously across vast geographic scales. The propagation of electromagnetic waves through any medium is bound by a finite velocity, traveling at the speed of light through a vacuum and slowing down as it passes through conductive or lossy media like dirt, rock, and atmosphere. Because the ranch's monitoring network spans a massive geographic footprint, a simultaneous, instantaneous reconfiguration across its entire baseline is a physical impossibility under any known electromagnetic mechanism. The data documented something that conventional physics explicitly forbids. Taylor's characterization of this finding, delivered with the intense restraint his professional discipline demands, is the closest he has come in 5 seasons of public communication to stating plainly that the instruments captured a force operating entirely outside our known physical framework. The vibration analysis yielded a complementary finding that Taylor treats with the exact same unvarnished directness. The source of the massive acoustic signature captured at the target depth originated from inside the subterranean void structure, not from the geological rock forming the boundary of the cavern. Something buried within that empty underground chamber produced a powerful physical event, the exact fraction of a second the drill bit pierced its outer wall. The characteristics of the event are fully documented, its source location is mathematically locked, and its temporal relationship to the drill's breakthrough is far beyond any statistical possibility of coincidence. What produced it? What is resting inside that hidden space? And why did the drill's arrival trigger such an immediate, system-wide retaliation? That is the definitive question the investigation's next phase must answer, and Taylor's analysis has framed it with more clinical precision than any prior study in history. Answering that question is exactly what the evacuation bought them time to prepare for. Fugal has been explicitly clear. This evacuation is not a conclusion. The investigation has not stopped, the property has not been abandoned, and the drilling operation has not been permanently terminated. Instead, the retreat created a mandatory tactical pause. Its entire purpose is to engineer a completely revised operational framework, one that reflects the dangerous reality of what the underground formation does when humans breach its primary boundary. The prior framework was built to deal with a formation that merely resisted. This new framework must be designed to deal with an intelligence that directly responds. Those are vastly different operational challenges, and the team is completely overhauling their strategy before they ever step back onto the property. The response profile documented during that fateful session, the instantaneous basin-wide electromagnetic reconfiguration, the simultaneous warming of the Mesa's surface, and the creeping physical symptoms that gripped multiple team members at once, paints a detailed, chilling picture of what the underground formation unleashes when its boundary is breached. The boundary penetration that comes next will be the single most significant operational decision in the history of Skinwalker Ranch. What will happen when a drill bit finally enters the deep, hollow interior of that subterranean space remains entirely unknown. The emergency evacuation bought the team precious time to prepare for that unknown with the full, terrifying weight of the data they just gathered. For 5 seasons, the investigation documented a phenomenon that merely resisted. Resistance is passive. It is an anomaly simply declining to be reached. What this drilling session documented was something else entirely. It was an active, directed response, precisely calibrated to the exact human action that provoked it and executed at a scale their previous safety protocols were never built to handle. This distinction matters more than anything else the team has established. A phenomenon that resists can eventually be mapped, bypassed, and progressively understood. But a phenomenon that responds has demonstrated an acute, terrifying awareness, one specific enough to direct energy at a precise human target at a precise coordinate. Whatever is resting inside that underground formation knew the exact moment the drill bit kissed its outer wall, and it lashed out to prove it. The evacuation was Brandon Fugal's explicit acknowledgement of what that demonstration means. When the drills eventually go back into the earth, they will go down with the heavy knowledge that whatever is waiting on the other side of the boundary knows exactly what is coming. Crossing that line will be what every prior season has been building toward. Yet, as the physical property undergoes a total lockdown, a parallel and deeply unsettling mystery has begun to unfold away from the cameras. New details have surfaced regarding what Bryant Dragon Arnold's life has become since his sudden, quiet disappearance from the Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, and what insiders are now revealing is far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. For 3 seasons, Dragon stood as the ranch's ultimate protector and enforcer. He was the man tasked with guarding the physical boundary between our ordinary world and whatever ancient force waited beyond it. But something happened to him out there in the high desert. Something occurred that didn't just push him away from the television production, it followed him home. Those who knew him closely now say he has never been the same. The ranch didn't just change Dragon, it marked him, and according to people close to the situation, that mark has become a psychological curse he cannot seem to escape. What is happening to him now goes far beyond anything ever shown on television. It is the tragic story of a man who dedicated everything to shielding others from the unknown, only to find himself transformed into its primary target. From unexplained, terrifying encounters that occurred entirely off camera, to the gradual psychological breakdown that ultimately forced him to walk away from his post, Dragon's current reality serves as a haunting warning. It is the ultimate proof of what happens when you stare too long into the abyss, and the abyss decides to stare back. Bryant Arnold wasn't supposed to disappear. He was a permanent fixture, rooted to the land like the Mesa itself. For years, he was their last line of defense, but the fortress he was guarding was built over a force that was slowly eroding him from the inside out. He was the one person Brandon Fugal trusted above all others to keep the ranch secure. Dragon didn't just protect the property from trespassers or curious tourists. He protected the world from what lived beneath that cursed ground. His very presence acted as a deterrent, not just to people, but to the unseen forces that seemed to pulse through the valley. But in the spring of his final season, something fundamental fractured. The crew noticed it first. Dragon stopped engaging in casual conversation. He avoided the command center unless it was absolutely necessary. He began triple-checking locks on doors that had never needed checking before. His nightly patrols became longer and more erratic, as if he were searching for something, or running from something he couldn't name. And then one morning, without warning or explanation, he drove off the property and never came back. There was no press release, no farewell episode, and no official statement. He was just gone. What most people don't know is that Dragon didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because staying meant losing himself completely. It meant surrendering to something that had been circling him for years, and according to those close to him, that surrender is exactly what is happening now. The man who once seemed unshakable has become a shadow of his former self, haunted by experiences that refuse to stay buried. Dragon's disappearance wasn't a clean ending. It was an escape attempt, and tragically it didn't work. Dragon's unraveling didn't start when the television cameras began rolling. It started years prior during his earliest patrols on the ranch, long before the show ever aired. Back then, he privately reported strange disturbances to Brandon Fugal, things he couldn't easily explain or rationalize. There were lights that moved aggressively against the wind direction, shadows that stretched impossibly long across the ground at high noon, and localized cold spots that manifested in the dead of the summer heat. Then came the night he spent alone on the West Ridge. During a routine patrol, he saw it for the very first time. A shimmering distortion hovering several feet above the ground, twisting the air around it like heat rising from asphalt on a scorching day. Except the air wasn't hot. It was freezing cold. Dragon froze in place. He didn't draw his weapon, he didn't radio for help, and he didn't run. He just stood there in the absolute darkness, watching as the distortion watched him back. There was an unmistakable intelligence to it, a presence that felt profoundly aware and calculating. Without warning, it vanished. It didn't fade gradually or drift away. It simply ceased to exist, as if someone had flipped a switch and deleted it from reality. Dragon never filed an official report about that night, never told the scientists what he had witnessed, and never mentioned it on camera. But from that night forward, he carried himself differently, like a man who knew he had been marked and chosen for something he couldn't yet comprehend. As the years passed and the show began filming, Dragon realized with growing dread that his instinct was right. Whatever had watched him on the West Ridge hadn't forgotten him. It was waiting, observing, and planning its next move. The moment that truly began pulling Dragon away from the investigation happened late one night near the south fence line, during what should have been a routine perimeter check. Dragon was walking the property line with 2 crew members after a massive wave of radio interference spiked across every channel simultaneously. They expected to find trespassers, or an equipment malfunction. Instead, the temperature dropped so hard and so fast that all 3 men's breath hung thick in the air like dense fog.
Even the desert insects went dead silent.
The quiet was oppressive, unnatural, and deeply wrong. That was when Dragon noticed the figure. It was a tall silhouette standing motionless on the ridge, backlit by nothing but pale moonlight. At first, he tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light. Then, it moved. It didn't move like a human being, nor like any animal he had ever tracked. It shifted sideways across the rugged terrain without taking a single step, gliding smoothly as if the laws of friction and physics didn't apply to it. One of the camera operators whispered urgently, "What the hell is that?" But Dragon didn't answer. His hand hovered over his sidearm, not drawing the weapon, but bracing his body for an impact he knew conventional steel couldn't stop. The figure paused at the base of the Mesa slope, seeming to regard them with invisible, heavy eyes, and then it vanished, leaving them alone in the freezing, silent dark. It simply blinked out of existence like a light being switched off. Dragon stepped forward slowly, almost against his will, as if pulled by a force he couldn't explain or resist. He scanned the ridge methodically, ordered the others to fall back to a safe distance, and attempted to radio base. But the moment he keyed the mic, the radio shrieked with a violent metallic warping noise that made both men cover their ears in pain. Once the agonizing interference finally cleared, Dragon spoke only 2 words into the receiver. "Shut it down." The next morning he acted as though nothing had happened, but everyone on the crew noticed the fundamental change in him. He stared at the Mesa longer during his patrols. He stopped joking with the camera crew. Something deep inside him had shifted permanently. Several weeks after that ridge encounter, Dragon was working late, reviewing drone footage alone in the command trailer, what he used to call his safe place. Historically, nothing strange ever happened in that trailer. No cold spots, no equipment failures, no unexplained shadows. It was the one building on the entire property that everyone trusted implicitly. But one night, shortly after midnight, as Dragon sat reviewing surveillance footage in complete solitude, every monitor in front of him froze simultaneously on the exact same frame. It was a frame that, by all logic, shouldn't have existed. On every screen from every single camera angle across the property, the footage showed the exact same impossible image. A silhouette standing directly behind Dragon inside the trailer, only a few feet from where he currently sat. It wasn't tall or monstrous in the traditional sense, but its proportions were fundamentally wrong. It was too long, too narrow, and the angles bent unnaturally, like something was wearing the shape of a human being, but didn't understand how to properly fit inside it. Dragon spun around instantly, his hand flashing to his weapon. Every muscle in his body tensed for a confrontation, but nothing was there. The space behind him was completely empty. Yet, the air in that exact spot was ice cold and heavy, almost wet, like he had suddenly opened a freezer door in a humid room. The monitors flickered erratically, and the silhouette vanished from the live screens. Then, one by one, in a chilling sequence, each screen began replaying the last 2 seconds of footage backward, completely independent of any input from Dragon. He hit keys frantically, slammed the power buttons repeatedly, and physically yanked cables from their connections, but it didn't matter. Nothing he did made any difference. The screen stayed alive, continuing to loop the impossibly reversed footage of something standing in the exact spot where he had been sitting moments before, with a distortion forming a kind of outline around the figure, like static electricity tracing its edges. But the face was the absolute worst part. It was blurred and smeared like wet paint dragged across a canvas, except for 2 dark hollows that stared out from the center of it, watching him with terrible focus, evaluating him like a specimen. By the time the system finally powered down completely, Dragon was shaken in a way no one on the crew had ever witnessed before. When the tech team checked all the equipment the next morning, they found absolutely nothing. There were no corrupted files, no glitch logs, and no abnormal activity recorded anywhere in the system. There was no trace of the silhouette, no evidence the monitors had ever malfunctioned, and no proof that anything unusual had happened at all. But Dragon knew exactly what he had seen. From that night forward, he absolutely refused to stay in the command trailer alone under any circumstances. The final breaking point came during what should have been just another routine nighttime perimeter sweep. Dragon had completed hundreds of these walks over the years, checking fence lines, monitoring sensors, and logging wildlife activity until it was pure muscle memory. But this particular night, the air felt fundamentally wrong from the moment he stepped outside. Even the other security personnel later admitted they could feel it too, a heaviness pressing down on everything, like the entire ranch was holding its breath, waiting for a strike. Halfway through the sweep, Dragon radioed in with something unusual. His voice wasn't panicked, not yet, but it carried an edge the team wasn't accustomed to hearing from him. "Do you copy?" I'm getting movement near Sector C, but it's not tripping any of the ground sensors. The command team immediately checked the monitoring system, and Dragon was absolutely right. There were no alerts, no thermal spikes, and no motion detection registering on any piece of equipment. Yet, he kept whispering into the radio that something was actively pacing him through the trees, staying just barely out of direct sight. He said he could hear it clearly: slow, deliberate steps, the sound of boots crunching on dirt, and the soft push and snap of branches being moved aside. But the thermal drones circling overhead showed only Dragon's isolated heat signature. There was nothing else out there. Then, without warning or explanation, he stopped answering the radio entirely. The command trailer erupted into chaos, with everyone shouting, scrambling, and trying desperately to reach him. By the time the rapid response team arrived at the far corner of the property, they found Dragon standing perfectly still beside the old cottonwood tree near the ravine. His flashlight hung loosely in his hand. Its beam pointed uselessly at the ground. His pupils were massively dilated despite the bright floodlights now surrounding him, and his breathing was shallow and rapid, like someone who had just witnessed something that shattered his understanding of reality. One of the crew members called his name repeatedly, but Dragon didn't react at all. It wasn't until Thomas physically grabbed his shoulder and shook him that Dragon finally snapped out of whatever trance held him, gasping desperately like someone who'd been held underwater for too long. When they frantically asked what had happened and what he'd seen out there in the darkness, he couldn't answer coherently. He just kept shaking his head violently, whispering over and over into the dead desert air. "You didn't see it! You didn't see it! You didn't see what was standing there," he whispered into the dead air. The team searched the entire area methodically. They found no footprints in the soft earth, no thermal traces lingering in the brush, and no broken branches. Absolutely nothing that could explain the primal terror still trembling through Dragon's body. But when technicians later reviewed his body cam footage back in the trailer, something even more deeply unsettling emerged from the digital recording. At the exact microsecond Dragon had stopped responding to radio calls, his microphone picked up a faint rhythmic clicking noise in the background. It was completely unnatural. It wasn't an animal call, nor was it the mechanical hum of machinery. It was a sound that seemed to be actively responding to his physical presence. Then, underneath the clicking barely audible beneath the static, a low, distorted whisper emerged. Audio technicians tried desperately to isolate the audio waveform, filtering and enhancing the track to understand its origin. But the deeper they analyzed the frequencies, the stranger it became. The acoustic pattern was entirely inconsistent with any known human vocal cord, yet it wasn't a standard electronic malfunction either. It existed in an impossible middle ground. When they showed Dragon the isolated, cleaned-up audio clip, he went pale and flatly refused to listen to it. In the days following the incident at the cottonwood tree, Dragon attempted to force himself back into his normal routine, acting as if nothing of significance had occurred. But the crew immediately noticed that he had grown profoundly guarded, restless, and was constantly looking over his shoulder. For the first time since joining the operation years ago, Dragon started keeping critical information entirely off the official record. It began when he insisted on reviewing all overnight surveillance footage completely alone, arriving at the command trailer hours before the rest of the team each morning. At first, nobody questioned it, assuming he was simply trying to make sense of his trauma. But then the automated system logs revealed a deeply concerning anomaly. Several high-definition files had been accessed, viewed multiple times, and then manually transferred into a heavily encrypted folder under Dragon's personal login credentials. The raw footage was suddenly locked away, completely inaccessible to anyone else on the team, including Brandon Fugal himself. When confronted about the data breach, Dragon brushed it off dismissively as routine security archiving, claiming it was standard protocol for sensitive material. But the explanation didn't sit right with anyone. He had never locked the investigative team out of data before. Then came the night that truly alarmed the inner circle. Brandon Fugal flew in urgently from Salt Lake City, responding to an encrypted private message Dragon had sent him directly, bypassing all normal communication channels. Late that night, the security cameras caught their tense silhouettes inside the command trailer. Their voices were deliberately muted, and the door was firmly locked from the inside. No one on the crew ever learned what Dragon showed the owner during that secret meeting. But when Brandon finally emerged hours later, he looked visibly rattled, shaken in a way the ranch had never affected him before, despite his years of dealing with bizarre occurrences. The only real clue came from a drone operator, who later swore under oath that he witnessed Dragon carefully carrying a small, heavy metal case out to his personal truck later that evening. It was an item he had retrieved from the restricted storage room where only the highest level physical evidence was kept under lock and key. Whatever was contained inside that case, Dragon handled it with extreme care, placing it gently on the passenger seat, as if it were highly fragile or immensely dangerous, before driving off the property into the dark. When he returned the next morning, Dragon was pale and visibly exhausted. He flatly refused to discuss where he had gone or what he had done with the contents of that case. The change in him was now complete and deeply troubling. Dragon had always been strict, intense, and occasionally paranoid about security, but now he was genuinely afraid, not of intruders and not of an abstract unknown phenomenon. He was terrified of something specific, something the ranch had shown him, something he had locked inside that metal case because he desperately feared it would change everything if it ever became public knowledge. From that day forward, Dragon stopped trusting the ranch's monitoring systems. He stopped trusting the investigation's scientific conclusions. And worst of all, he stopped trusting the crew members he had stood alongside for years. The night everything finally fell apart began quietly enough. The team was gathered in the command center, carefully reviewing anomalies from the previous night's investigation, when one of the central monitors suddenly flickered for a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, but in that brief glitch, the screen froze on a frame that absolutely should not have existed anywhere in their database. On the monitor, clear as day, the footage from the previous night's patrol showed a shadow standing directly behind Dragon. It was tall, unnaturally thin, completely featureless, and loomed just inches from his back. Dragon had never reported seeing anything behind him during that sweep. When Dragon walked into the command center moments later, and his eyes hit the frozen image on the screen, his entire body went completely rigid. Every muscle tensed, and for several long seconds, he didn't even appear to breathe. "That wasn't there," he muttered, his voice entirely lacking conviction. Dr. Travis Taylor stepped forward carefully, studying both the horrifying projection on the screen and the shattered expression on the face of the man who was supposed to be their protector. "Dragon, that figure was standing directly behind you in this footage," Travis said, his voice dropping an octave as he pointed at the pixelated geometry on the screen. "Are you seriously telling us you didn't see anything unusual during this patrol?" "No!" Dragon snapped defensively, but the sudden crack in his voice completely betrayed him. Everyone in the room could see it. He was either lying in profound denial or dealing with something far worse. Before anyone could press him further, the command center radios suddenly hissed with a harsh, abrasive static. Every head in the room turned toward the speakers simultaneously. Through the abrasive white noise, a voice began to whisper, broken, distant, and completely impossible to pinpoint or identify. At first, the team tried to rationalize it as random atmospheric interference or radio bounce, but then the signal tightened, becoming unmistakably crystal clear. Despite the heavy layer of static, it formed a single distinct word: Brian. The entire team immediately shot their eyes back to Dragon. That was his real name, his birth name. Only a small handful of people in his entire life ever called him that. To everyone on the ranch and within the investigation, he was known exclusively by his moniker. The radio crackled again, louder and more aggressive this time. The whisper stretched and distorted, taking on an unnatural, almost mocking quality as it repeated his name slowly, drawing out the syllables like a cold breath in winter. Dragon stood completely frozen. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the master control desk just to steady his weight. "That's not normal interference," Travis said quietly, voicing the stark reality that clamped down on the room. Dragon couldn't answer. He just stared at the radio speaker, breathing hard through clenched teeth, caught in a terrifying vice between absolute rage and sheer panic. Then, the whisper returned one final time. It was clearer and sharper than any transmission they had ever intercepted, and every single hair on the back of Dragon's neck visibly stood up as the speaker hissed two words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Behind you." Dragon spun around so violently and with such sudden velocity that his hip clipped an expensive equipment chair, sending it crashing violently to the floor. Nothing was there. The space directly behind him was completely empty. But at the precise millisecond he turned, the entire command center's ambient temperature plummeted an astonishing 20 degrees in seconds. The crew's breath instantly hung visible in the air. The monitoring cameras flickered erratically, tearing the digital feed, and then the nightmare truly manifested. The exact same featureless silhouette from the frozen footage appeared again. But this time, it was broadcasting on a live, real-time feed, standing perfectly still in the exact spot where Dragon had been positioned just seconds prior. When Dragon saw his own live image on the screen, shadowed by that impossibly narrow, distorted entity. He whispered something that absolutely no one on the crew had ever heard from his lips in all their years of intense, high-risk work together. "I'm done." And for the first time in the entire recorded history of the operation, the man who had sworn to protect the property turned his back on the monitors and walked straight out of the command center, leaving the security lockdown protocols completely unexecuted. Dragon didn't return to his quarters that night. He stayed outside in the dark, a solitary silhouette pacing the dirt road that led toward the main gate. Every few minutes he would stop dead in his tracks, turn sharply, and stare deeply into the tree line as if he expected a physical manifestation to step out of the brush. Inside the trailer, the remaining team watched him through the infrared cameras, deeply unsettled and debating whether it was even safe to intervene. By sunrise, Travis found Dragon sitting on his truck's tailgate, his shoulders slumped as he stared blankly at the dirt. When Travis approached, Dragon didn't even look up. "It's not the ranch," he muttered, his voice hollow. "It's me." Travis frowned, stepping closer. "What does that mean, Dragon?" Dragon took a long, shaky breath. "This place doesn't just follow you, Travis. It chooses you, and something out there chose me a long time ago." He finally confessed the truth of his first season on the property. Long before the television show ever aired, and right after Brandon Fugal had first purchased the land, something had appeared to him on the West Ridge. It was a shimmering distortion that moved without a sound. He had been so terrified that he never filed a report, never told the owners, and never uttered a word to the incoming scientists. "It watched me," he whispered. "It was like it already knew everything about me, and now it's back. It's following me again." The surrounding crew listened in stunned, heavy silence. When the team began preparing for the next active investigation phase later that afternoon, Dragon didn't put on his gear. He walked slowly over to Brandon's truck, placed his official security badge firmly on the hood, and delivered a single final sentence. "If I stay here, it won't stop." He climbed into the cab of his truck, started the engine, and drove toward the gate. The production cameras caught one final haunting shot reflected in his side view mirror. His face was completely pale, and his eyes were rigidly fixed on the disappearing silhouette of the Mesa behind him. 1 week after Dragon drove off Skinwalker Ranch for the final time, Brandon Fugal quietly and officially confirmed that his most trusted protector had permanently stepped away from the project. There was no contract dispute, no salary negotiation, and no creative differences. He left because the entity beneath the earth was no longer just observing the team. It had singled him out, proving that when you spend years guarding the boundary against the unknown eventually learns your name. It was calling him by name, but leaving didn't end it. According to those who have seen him since, Dragon's life has become entirely unrecognizable. He lives alone now, far from Utah, in a reclusive location he absolutely refuses to reveal. Friends say he has become deeply distrustful of electronics, paranoid about being watched, and obsessively checks his windows while refusing to sleep without the lights on. He completely stonewalls any discussion about the ranch. When a former crew member finally managed to reach him by phone last year, Dragon answered, but whispered only 3 hollow words before hanging up. "It's still here." Others report he has moved multiple times, always fleeing at night and always without warning, like a man running from a shadow that refuses to let go. The true tragedy of Bryant Arnold isn't just that he left Skinwalker Ranch. It's that a part of the ranch left with him. No matter how far he runs, whatever chose him that night on the West Ridge is still watching, still waiting, and still calling his name in the dark. Yet, as the modern team grapples with Dragon's sudden absence, a parallel discovery back on the property has recontextualized his entire trauma. Deep beneath the rugged terrain of Skinwalker Ranch lies a cabin investigators were never meant to find. This weather-beaten patrol shelter, long used by the head of security as a simple rest stop, has now been exposed as something far more sinister, a classified containment chamber tied to decades-old psychological studies. What the team dug up beneath its floorboards forced internal security to immediately seal the site, possibly forever, revealing a terrifying truth. Dragon was never actually the guard. He was the test subject. Long before anyone on the current research team even knew it existed, this remote patrol cabin sat half-buried in silence at the farthest edge of the property line. From a distance, it looked completely harmless. A faded structure with weather-beaten boards, a sagging corrugated roof, and a door that creaked idly in the desert wind like any forgotten storage shed meant for emergency supplies. Most new arrivals barely glanced at it, assuming it was just another old ranch scar that time had stopped noticing. but the silence surrounding the structure was always louder than the wind that rattled its walls. The first real sign that something was deeply wrong came from above. When high-resolution aerial mapping was conducted for site monitoring, analysts noticed that the cabin did not appear on any historical construction records. There were no listings, no permits, no maintenance logs, and absolutely nothing in prior land development files to account for its presence. It was as if it wasn't supposed to exist. When deeper archives were pulled, government land surveys from decades prior showed that exact spot marked as a restricted research point long before Skinwalker Ranch ever became a matter of public curiosity. The cabin wasn't built where it made practical sense. It was built where an anomaly was already waiting. Satellite scans soon revealed a second, deeper anomaly. The building's precise coordinates fell within a classified sensor monitoring zone that had been hidden during the property's acquisition. Strangely, no external power lines connected to it, and there were no visible communications relays to explain why the site was flagged. Internal employees later admitted they ignored it at first because some locations on the ranch are simply better left undocumented. That comfortable ignorance changed the day Dragon was assigned to the post, not to protect what was inside, but to unknowingly interact with it. Someone, somewhere, already knew that the cabin was never meant to serve people. It was engineered to study them. When investigators finally entered the structure with full structural clearance, their initial confusion turned to dread. Ranch buildings are typically assembled with pure utility in mind. Straight beams, visible nails, and basic insulation. This cabin followed none of those conventions. The interior dimensions measured nearly 3 feet larger than the external foundation. A spatial impossibility achieved through intentional architectural manipulation. Furthermore, nails were embedded into the wood in tight spiral configurations rather than linear framing. This indicated repeated, meticulous internal reconstruction, not to repair weather damage, but to actively modify the chamber's layout from the inside. Underneath the rotting floorboards, the true nature of the cabin emerged. Investigators uncovered industrial-grade electromagnetic grounding plates, the exact kind utilized in classified laboratory environments to prevent external signal interference or the contamination of energy readings. These plates were anchored directly above soil that appeared to be chemically sterilized. Multiple layers of heavy metallic shielding were positioned to completely block out frequencies rather than protect the interior from the elements. No ordinary ranch utility shed would ever require that level of electromagnetic suppression. In fact, it shouldn't even have been possible to install such technology that deep in the desert without formal contracting, heavy machinery, and recorded logistics. Yet there were no construction files, no records of delivery trucks, and no engineering correspondences. Worse still, environmental sensors inside the cabin documented temperature fluctuations that rose and fell in exact 5-degree increments at rigidly scheduled intervals, regulated with lab-like precision. Dust drifted abnormally through the air, collecting only on surfaces that sat directly away from hidden sensor alignments. The very air felt unnaturally dense, as though the room were designed to transmit static memory rather than store humidity. According to sensory log reconstruction, the space behaved less like a shelter and more like an active test chamber meticulously tuned to interact with a living cognitive presence. When partial engineering blueprints surfaced through digital data recovery, the reality became undeniable. The cabin was not built to protect the staff from the ranch's phenomena. It was built to trap them inside a controlled environment of sustained exposure, a passive observation box manipulated to seem harmless, yet hardwired with layered influence circuitry embedded into every board and beam. The real question wasn't how it was built without anyone noticing, but who had approved the construction of a psychological exposure chamber disguised as a simple ranch shack. When Bryant Arnold originally joined the security division, he fully believed his role was standard, monitoring restricted zones, tracking perimeter breaches, and deterring trespassers. On paper, his daily assignments seemed perfectly logical. In reality, he had been marked for this exact role years earlier. Data reconstruction from decrypted research archives revealed that his employment file overlapped perfectly with psychological compatibility assessments pulled from a retired Cold War behavioral project. The traits flagged by that classified project as ideal for long-term exposure testing were identical to what Dragon's recruitment form highlighted as his greatest professional strengths: absolute emotional restraint, high observational focus, strict adherence to routine, and minimal reactive behavior. This match was not an accidental coincidence. He perfectly fit a pre-established test subject profile. Internal logs recovered from beneath the cabin floorboards listed those exact traits under a chilling column labeled Subject Stability Threshold, Phase 3 Qualification. His name never appeared in full. Instead, his initials were cross-referenced next to coded reference strings, proving that he was being evaluated and chosen long before he ever stepped foot onto the cursed soil of Skinwalker Ranch. Investigators reviewing this precise alignment stated flatly that he was not hired because he was well-suited for security. He was strategically placed because his psychological profile made him uniquely vulnerable to influence induction. As the months passed, the subtle cognitive interference began to bleed directly into Dragon's personal logbooks. His entries underwent a bizarre transition, shifting from precise, professionally structured security reports into fragmented expressions of deep psychological discomfort. He began writing in short thoughts and incomplete sentences, his notes carrying a heavy emotional weight without any visible real-world trigger. In isolated, unbroadcast audio recordings, he described sensing sudden, violent shifts in his mood and physical energy whenever he drew near the cabin. He began noting a pervasive feeling of being observed, even when surrounding environmental sensors read completely clear. Unsure whether this crushing pressure came from the land or from something fracturing within his own mind, his handwriting became wildly uneven during extended shifts, perfectly aligning with what the old Cold War documents classified as optimal effective disorientation patterns. What makes Dragon's case uniquely tragic is that he never volunteered for any experiment. He never even knew one was occurring. When researchers finally gained the necessary system-level clearance to pull up the foundation beneath Dragon's patrol cabin, they assumed they would uncover forgotten ranch wiring, old weather damage, or perhaps improperly stored tools. Instead, lifting the warped heavy floorboards revealed a subterranean installation that did not resemble standard construction in any capacity. A heavy rectangular metal panel sat embedded far deeper than a typical foundation depth, sealed tight with cold industrial bolts that matched no commercial hardware available to a normal ranch. The heavy fasteners were consistent with those used on sealed transport cases for classified military and laboratory assets, designed specifically to survive high pressure, intense heat, and severe electromagnetic fluctuation. The panel cracked open to reveal a reinforced metal compartment, professionally fabricated and heavily insulated. This was not a maintenance crawl space. It was an active installation. Inside lay an evidence-style containment tray, organized with the clinical precision of a forensic archive. Each item had been methodically placed, not casually tossed aside. Thick, heavily tinted evidence vials were labeled with non-standard identifiers like AOMA, anomaly, and refuse human study. There were no dates and no signature fields. Just stark, cold lettering consistent with internal cataloging codes used in discontinued high-risk biocontainment research programs. Next to the vials sat a folded Kevlar pad bearing thick, dried stains. Surface samples returned cellular structure patterns completely inconsistent with human or any registered wildlife blood, with machine analysis flagging the material as an unclassified biological origin. Beside the stained pad, investigators discovered several bone fragments. They were perfectly smooth, unnaturally dense, chemically resistant, and emitted a slight luminescence when subjected to infrared spectrum scanning. While the physical size of the fragments was far too small for any known large fauna, density scans suggested an impact resistance well beyond normal evolutionary design. The final layer of the compartment contained a sealed microfilm envelope labeled Echo Gateway Failure Report. Its contents detailed a harrowing timeline of electromagnetic exposure testing, cognitive response analytics, and radiation pattern tracking. The very last page read, Subject destabilized, threshold exceeded, terminate field sequence. When researchers finally found Dragon's personal logbook buried deep inside his patrol bag, they expected the standard routine entries of a security guard, weather updates, ranch patrol logs, and gate scans. What they uncovered instead was the slow, agonizing unraveling of a man who genuinely believed he was simply guarding a piece of property, completely unaware he was the one trapped inside the glass. The early pages of the journal appeared perfectly normal, filled with neat, disciplined handwriting, precise notes on trail statuses, and exact motion sensor activation times. But midway through the journal, the tone fractured completely. Sentences grew shorter. Words literally broke apart on the page. His handwriting slanted unevenly across the margins, as if written with a violently shaking hand. And then, the timestamps began to actively contradict reality. Several entries repeated the exact same minute, but described entirely different emotional states with each iteration. One line read, 0317 felt normal. The very next line, marked with the exact same time, read 0317, pressure behind eyes like something pushing thoughts into place. Some timestamps were marked days into the literal future, while others looped backwards, mirroring the impossible chronological distortion that was later discovered in the trailer's compromised security footage. It was as if time inside Dragon's memory no longer followed the rules of the outside world. Most disturbing of all, however, were the notes scribbled in the margins. At first glance, they looked like medical-style observations written in a smaller, far more controlled script, as if a doctor or handler had hijacked the journal and added them later. But forensic analysis confirmed a more terrifying truth. It was indeed Dragon's handwriting, but written while his brain was under intense, localized neurological stress. The margin notes explicitly referenced forced cognitive shifting, emotional override, and recall disruption patterns. The guard wasn't monitoring the perimeter. The perimeter was rewritten inside the guard, leaving him to document his own psychological dismantling from the inside out. At first, investigators believed he was merely documenting his symptoms. Later, the horrific reality set in. He was mirroring the exact technical language found in the classified microfilm experiments buried directly beneath the cabin floorboards. One specific passage stopped the review team cold, written in a hand that barely seemed his own. Something watches from inside the walls, not with eyes. It waits for me to react before it does. I dream of walking away, but wake up standing in the doorway. The ultimate breakthrough came when data analysts overlaid the emotional peaks recorded in Dragon's logbook with the electrical and energy fluctuation reports from the monitoring devices hidden inside the cabin walls. What the team discovered still causes an absolute heavy silence whenever it is mentioned in internal briefings. Every single time Dragon documented a spike in stress, confusion, or sudden emotional collapse, the structural monitoring systems registered sharp electromagnetic surges at the exact same timestamp, down to the second. This meant the environment was not merely reacting to him. It was actively tracking his mental state in real time, feeding on his psychological distress. Archived data from the recovered files showed layout diagrams of the cabin explicitly labeled anchor zone, cognitive trigger line, and exposure conduit. These were not ordinary structural architectural markers. They matched the cold clinical terms used during classified Cold War field research involving prolonged isolation and interaction with non-standard environmental stimuli. The cabin, according to these blueprints, was never intended to protect him from the elements. It was built to encourage and channel contact with an unseen influence. Further review uncovered audio interference perfectly synchronized with Dragon's log entries. In audio recordings captured during his nightly patrols, low-frequency pulses appeared intermittently whenever he expressed heightened fear in his writing. Specialized sound analysis revealed nearly inaudible, human-like resonance waves layered beneath the low, mechanical hum. When separated digitally, these pulses formed rhythm patterns resembling neural response triggers used in cognitive field tests. Whatever was affecting him wasn't an erratic, random environmental byproduct. It was an intelligent system behaving as though it were calculating a response. But the most alarming finding wasn't found in audio waves or electrical logs. It came from thermal mapping scans conducted months after his final entry. The scans revealed a consistent temperature dip of exactly 5 degrees for 7-minute intervals, perfectly matching the precision of Dragon's behavioral shifts mentioned in his journal. It was the exact same timing and the exact same thermal change every single day. What the team uncovered next was something that had never been discussed on camera, not during official briefings and not even behind closed doors on the ranch. When experts finally processed the microfilm labeled Echo Gateway Failure Report, the contents shattered any remaining assumption that Dragon was merely an isolated casualty. It revealed there was a previous subject, someone who was never supposed to be mentioned again. The report, dated decades earlier, described an experimental phase that took place long before Skinwalker Ranch became known to the public. The original subject was placed in a structure almost identical to Dragon's cabin, the same electromagnetic grid layout, the same unnatural internal dimensions, and the exact same proximity to the anomaly. But unlike Dragon, that individual was not monitored openly by colleagues. They were monitored remotely by a hidden entity. According to the final line of that historical failure report, the contact escalation exceeded the subject's psychological tolerance threshold, resulting in systemic collapse. Nowhere in the pages did it mention a rescue attempt. Even more disturbing, the temperature logs, behavioral field responses, and radiation interference patterns from that abandoned, decades-old test perfectly mirrored Dragon's data nearly 40 years later. This implied a terrifying truth. Whatever force was interacting with him didn't just recognize the setup, It remembered it. It was behaving as if the experiment had simply been restarted after a long pause. Handwritten in the margin of one microfilm page were the chilling words, "Pattern persists. Entity preference indicates continuity." That simple phrase terrified the analysts. It meant what was being studied was showing deliberate recognition. And then, just beneath that phrase, a final note in faded ink read, "Subject history must remain undisclosed. Current anchor unaware of precedent." The discovery of a hidden envelope marked, "If I don't come back," shifted the entire investigation from cold scientific analysis into something deeply personal and terrifying. It was not stored inside the locker where evidence was meant to be kept. Instead, it was hidden behind a thin wooden panel near the back wall of the cabin, tucked away like someone wanted it to remain a secret unless things reached a catastrophic breaking point where returning was no longer an option. The message inside was short, written in Bryant Dragon Arnold's own handwriting, but it read like the words of a man who no longer trusted his own thoughts. He didn't speak about physical threats the way investigators expected. He didn't refer to a physical creature, a presence, or even a direct danger lurking in the dark. Instead, his desperate message described a quiet, unstoppable shift taking place inside his own mind. He wrote that he began waking up inside the cabin without any memory of ever lying down. He felt sudden emotional responses that did not match what he was actually thinking. And most chilling of all, he genuinely believed that something was trying to learn about our world through him. He described terrifying moments where he felt an almost magnetic draw back toward the structure after leaving, as if his survival instincts had been completely reprogrammed. At one point, he scribbled, "When my mind goes quiet, I feel it try to speak through the silence." That sentence alone broke several researchers emotionally. Next to the note was a small folded photograph. It showed Dragon standing outside the cabin during a normal daytime patrol, appearing calm, stable, and focused. But what was handwritten on the back made experts question whether the person in the picture was even the same man who wrote the letter. The words read simply, "This is me," before the cabin noticed. The note ended with one final warning, left like a desperate instruction. "Do not enter alone. The cabin does not forget who it watches." The final breakthrough came not from letters or hidden compartments, but from the last working camera pointed directly at the patrol cabin. At first glance, the recordings appeared entirely normal, quiet desert nights, still wind, and empty ground. But just days before Dragon stopped showing up to work, the footage began displaying structural anomalies that digital experts still cannot explain. Time didn't just move forward or backward, it began replaying itself differently. A minute of footage would play, then rewind, then repeat. But with each loop, tiny, impossible changes appeared. A rock that had been on the left side of the frame would shift inches, even feet, without any visible movement. Tree branches bent at entirely different angles between loops. In one sequence, the cabin itself appeared wider than before, and then narrower in the next loop, despite never physically changing in reality. The strangest clip showed a metal toolbox sitting near the entrance, a toolbox that, according to team logistics logs, was not even brought onto the property until 3 days after the timestamp on the recording. It was labeled by analysts as reverse time footage, reality recorded from the future. When researchers slowed the footage down frame by frame, they noticed faint flashes along the edges of the screen. It wasn't camera glare, insects, or weather interference. The flashing geometric shapes perfectly matched the symbols found in the microfilm labeled Echo Gateway Failure Report, almost as if the phenomenon was trying to communicate using the encryption system of the old experiment. Soon after, things escalated. In one recording, the shadow cast by the camera pole began to fade until it disappeared altogether, even though the real, physical pole was still standing outside under the sun. Then the entire image turned pitch black. There were no error codes, no static, and no signal loss, just absolute silence. Over the next 24 hours, every single camera facing the cabin stopped working the exact same way. It wasn't because the hardware broke, it was because something stopped allowing them to see. The immediate decision was made to seal the cabin permanently. Dragon avoided all interviews, the team locked the evidence away, and Skinwalker Ranch quietly marked the entire sector as a restricted zone. Yet new details have surfaced about what Bryant Dragon Arnold's life has become since his sudden disappearance from the Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. What insiders are now revealing is far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. For 3 seasons, Dragon stood as the ranch's ultimate protector and enforcer, the man who guarded the boundary between our world and whatever waited beyond it. But the terrifying truth discovered beneath his cabin suggests he wasn't standing guard over the anomaly. The anomaly was standing guard over him. But something happened to him out there. Something that didn't just push him away from the cameras, it followed him home. The tragic reality of Dragon's life after Skinwalker Ranch reveals why those who knew him say he's never been the same. The ranch didn't just change Dragon, it marked him. And according to people close to the situation, that mark has become a psychological curse he cannot escape. This is the story of a man who dedicated everything to protecting others from the unknown, only to find himself transformed into its primary target. From unexplained encounters that were never filmed, to the gradual breakdown that forced him to walk away, to the haunting reality of his life today, Dragon's story stands as a warning about what happens when you stare too long into the abyss and the abyss decides to stare back. Bryant Arnold wasn't supposed to disappear. He was the kind of man who seemed permanent, rooted to the land like the Mesa itself. For years, he was more than just security. He was the last line of defense, the one person Brandon Fugal trusted above all others to keep the ranch secure. Dragon didn't just protect the property from trespassers or curious tourists. He protected the world from what lived beneath that cursed ground. His very presence was a deterrent, not just to people, but to whatever unseen forces seemed to pulse through that valley. But in the spring of his final season, something fundamental fractured. The crew noticed it first. Dragon stopped engaging in casual conversation. He avoided the command center unless it was absolutely necessary. He began triple-checking locks on doors that had never needed checking before. His patrols became longer and more erratic, as if he were searching for something, or running from something he couldn't name. And then one morning, without any warning or explanation, he drove off the property and never came back. There was no press release, no farewell episode, and no official statement. He was just gone. What most people don't know is that Dragon didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because staying meant losing himself completely, surrendering to something that had been circling him for years. According to those close to him, that surrender is exactly what is happening now. The man who once seemed unshakable has become a shadow of his former self, haunted by experiences that refuse to stay buried. Dragon's disappearance wasn't an ending. It was an escape attempt. And tragically, it didn't work. Dragon's unraveling didn't start when the cameras were rolling. It started years before, during his earliest patrols on the ranch, long before the show ever aired. Back then, he reported strange disturbances directly to Brandon Fugal, things he couldn't easily explain or rationalize. There were lights that moved aggressively against the wind direction, shadows that stretched impossibly long across the ground at high noon, and localized cold spots that appeared without warning in the middle of the summer heat. And then, one night alone on the West Ridge during a routine patrol, he saw it for the first time. A shimmering distortion hovered several feet above the ground, twisting the air around it like heat rising from asphalt on a scorching day. But the temperature wasn't hot, it was freezing cold. Dragon froze in place. He didn't draw his weapon, he didn't radio for help, and he didn't move at all. He just stood there in the darkness, watching as the thing watched him back. There was an unmistakable intelligence to it, a presence that felt profoundly aware and calculating. Then, without warning, it vanished. It didn't fade gradually or drift away. It simply ceased to exist, as if someone had flipped a switch and instantly removed it from reality. Dragon never filed an official report about the incident, never told the scientists what he'd witnessed, and never mentioned it on camera or in any interview. But from that night forward, he carried himself differently, like a man who knew he'd been marked, tagged and chosen for something he couldn't yet understand. As the years passed and the show began filming, Dragon realized with growing dread that he was right. Whatever had watched him that night on the West Ridge hadn't forgotten him. It was waiting, observing, and planning its next move. The moment that truly began pulling Dragon away from the show happened late one night near the south fence line, during what should have been a routine perimeter check. Dragon was walking the property with 2 crew members after strange radio interference spiked across every channel simultaneously. They expected to find trespassers, maybe teenagers trying to sneak onto the property, or perhaps just an equipment malfunction. Instead, the temperature dropped so hard and so fast that all 3 men's breath hung thick in the air like dense fog. Even the desert insects stopped making sound. The silence was oppressive, unnatural, and deeply wrong. That's when Dragon noticed it. A tall figure stood motionless on the ridge, silhouetted against the night sky, backlit by nothing but pale moonlight. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, a simple trick of the light, his mind merely filling in patterns where none existed. Then it moved. It didn't move like a human being, nor like any animal he had ever tracked. The silhouette shifted sideways across the rugged terrain without taking a single step, gliding smoothly as if the laws of friction and physics didn't apply to it at all. One of the camera operators whispered urgently, "What the hell is that?" But Dragon didn't answer. His hand hovered rigidly over his sidearm, not drawing the weapon, but bracing himself for an impact he knew conventional steel couldn't stop. The figure paused at the base of the Mesa slope, seeming to regard them with heavy, invisible eyes. And then it vanished. It didn't walk away into the darkness, and it didn't run. It simply blinked out of existence like a light being switched off. Dragon stepped forward slowly, almost against his own will, as if pulled by an attractive force he couldn't explain or resist. He scanned the ridge methodically, ordered the terrified crew members to fall back to a safe distance, and keyed his mic to radio base. But the moment he pressed the button, the radio shrieked with a violent metallic warping noise so intense that both men covered their ears in physical pain. Once the agonizing interference finally cleared, Dragon spoke only 2 words into the receiver. "Shut it down." The next morning he acted as though nothing had happened, but everyone on the crew noticed the fundamental change in him. He stared at the Mesa longer during his patrols. He completely stopped joking with the camera crew. Something deep inside his psyche had shifted permanently. Several weeks after that ridge encounter, Dragon was working late, reviewing drone footage alone in the command trailer, what he used to call his safe place. Historically, nothing strange ever happened in that trailer. There were no cold spots, no equipment failures, and no unexplained shadows. It was the one building on the entire property that the entire team trusted implicitly. But one night, shortly after midnight, as Dragon sat reviewing the surveillance footage in complete solitude, every monitor in front of him froze simultaneously on the exact same frame. It was a frame that, by all logic, shouldn't have existed. On every screen, from every single camera angle across the ranch, the footage showed the exact same impossible image: a silhouette standing directly behind Dragon inside the trailer, only a few feet from where he was currently sitting. It wasn't tall or monstrous in the traditional sense, but its proportions were fundamentally wrong. It was too long, too narrow, and its limbs bent at unnatural angles, like something was forcing itself into the shape of a human being, but didn't understand how to properly fit inside the anatomy. Dragon spun around instantly, his hand flashing to his weapon, every muscle tensed for a lethal confrontation. But nothing was there. The space behind him was completely empty. Yet the air in that exact spot was ice-cold and heavy, almost wet, like he had suddenly opened a freezer door in a humid room. The monitors flickered erratically, and the silhouette vanished from the live screens. Then, one by one, in a chilling sequence, each screen began replaying the last 2 seconds of footage backward, completely independent of any input from Dragon. He hit keys frantically, slammed the power buttons repeatedly, and physically yanked cables from their connections, but it didn't matter. Nothing he did made any difference. The screens stayed alive, continuing to loop the impossibly reversed footage of something standing in the exact spot where he had been sitting moments before. A strange electromagnetic distortion formed a kind of outline around the figure, like static electricity tracing its raw edges. But the face was the absolute worst part. It was blurred and smeared, like wet paint dragged violently across a canvas, except for 2 dark, empty hollows that stared out from the center of it. They watched him with a terrible, unblinking focus, evaluating him like a specimen trapped under a microscope. No footprints were left in the soft earth. There were no thermal traces lingering in the brush, no broken branches, absolutely nothing that could explain the primal terror still vibrating through Dragon's body. But when technicians later reviewed his body cam footage back in the trailer, a deeply unsettling detail emerged from the digital recording. At the exact microsecond Dragon had stopped responding to radio calls, his microphone picked up a faint rhythmic clicking noise in the background. It was completely unnatural. It wasn't an animal call, nor was it the mechanical hum of machinery. It was a sound that seemed to be actively responding to his physical presence. Then, underneath the clicking barely audible beneath the static, a low distorted whisper emerged. Audio technicians tried desperately to isolate the audio waveform, filtering and enhancing the track to understand its origin. But the deeper they analyzed the frequencies, the stranger it became. The acoustic pattern was entirely inconsistent with any known human vocal cord, yet it wasn't a standard electronic malfunction either. It existed in an impossible middle ground. When they showed Dragon the isolated, cleaned-up audio clip, he went pale and flatly refused to listen to it. In the days following the incident at the cottonwood tree, Dragon attempted to force himself back into his normal routine, acting as if nothing of significance had occurred. But the crew immediately noticed that he had grown profoundly guarded, restless, and was constantly looking over his shoulder. For the first time since joining the operation years ago, Dragon started keeping critical information entirely off the official record. It began when he insisted on reviewing all overnight surveillance footage completely alone, arriving at the command trailer hours before the rest of the team each morning. At first, nobody questioned it, assuming he was simply trying to make sense of his trauma. But then the automated system logs revealed a deeply concerning anomaly. Several high-definition files had been accessed, viewed multiple times, and then manually transferred into a heavily encrypted folder under Dragon's personal login credentials. The raw footage was suddenly locked away, completely inaccessible to anyone else on the team, including Brandon Fugal himself. When confronted about the data breach, Dragon brushed it off dismissively as routine security archiving, claiming it was standard protocol for sensitive material. But the explanation didn't sit right with anyone. He had never locked the investigative team out of data before. Then came the night that truly alarmed the inner circle. Brandon Fugal flew in urgently from Salt Lake City, responding to an encrypted private message Dragon had sent him directly, bypassing all normal communication channels. Late that night, the security cameras caught their tense silhouettes inside the command trailer. Their voices were deliberately muted, and the door was firmly locked from the inside. No one on the crew ever learned what Dragon showed the owner during that secret meeting. But when Brandon finally emerged hours later, he looked visibly rattled, shaken in a way the ranch had never affected him before, despite his years of dealing with bizarre occurrences. The only real clue came from a drone operator, who later swore that he witnessed Dragon carefully carrying a small, heavy metal case out to his personal truck later that evening. It was an item he had retrieved from the restricted storage room where only the highest level physical evidence was kept under lock and key. Whatever was contained inside that case, Dragon handled it with extreme care, placing it gently on the passenger seat, as if it were highly fragile or immensely dangerous, before driving off the property into the dark. When he returned the next morning, Dragon was pale and visibly exhausted. He flatly refused to discuss where he had gone or what he had done with the contents of that case. The change in him was now complete and deeply troubling. Dragon had always been strict, intense, and occasionally paranoid about security, but now he was genuinely afraid, not of intruders and not of an abstract unknown phenomenon. He was terrified of something specific, something the ranch had shown him, something he had locked inside that metal case because he desperately feared it would change everything if it ever became public knowledge. From that day forward, Dragon stopped trusting the ranch's monitoring systems. He stopped trusting the investigation's scientific conclusions. And worst of all, he stopped trusting the crew members he had stood alongside for years. The night everything finally fell apart began quietly enough. The team was gathered in the command center, carefully reviewing anomalies from the previous night's investigation, when one of the central monitors suddenly flickered for a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, but in that brief glitch, the screen froze on a frame that absolutely should not have existed anywhere in their database. On the monitor, clear as day, the footage from the previous night's patrol showed a shadow standing directly behind Dragon. It was tall, unnaturally thin, completely featureless, and loomed just inches from his back. Dragon had never reported seeing anything behind him during that sweep. When Dragon walked into the command center moments later, and his eyes hit the frozen image on the screen, his entire body went completely rigid. Every muscle tensed, and for several long seconds, he didn't even appear to breathe. "That wasn't there," he muttered, his voice entirely lacking conviction. Dr. Travis Taylor stepped forward carefully, studying both the horrifying projection on the screen and the shattered expression on the face of the man who was supposed to be their protector. Dragon's long battle with the unseen had finally breached his defenses, leaving the team to realize that the threat wasn't just on the perimeter, it had found its way inside. And worst of all, he stopped trusting the crew members he had stood alongside for years. The unbreakable bond of security and brotherhood that had anchored the ranch's defense for seasons dissolved into a thick, suffocating cloud of mutual suspicion. The night everything finally fell apart began quietly enough. The team was gathered in the command center, carefully reviewing anomalies from the previous night's investigation, when one of the central monitors suddenly flickered without warning, just for a single second, barely noticeable to anyone but a trained observer. But in that brief moment, the screen displayed something that sent ice straight through everyone's veins. A frame that absolutely should not have existed anywhere in their database. On the monitor, clear as day, was an image showing a silhouette standing directly behind Dragon in footage recorded the previous night. It was tall, unnaturally thin, completely featureless, and loomed just inches from his back. Dragon had never reported seeing anyone or anything during that patrol. When Dragon walked into the command center moments later, and his eyes hit the frozen image still displayed on the screen, he went completely rigid. Every muscle in his body tensed for several long seconds. He didn't even appear to breathe. "That wasn't there," he muttered, but his voice completely lacked conviction. Dr. Travis Taylor stepped forward carefully, studying both the screen and Dragon's raw reaction. "Dragon, that figure was standing directly behind you in this footage. Are you seriously telling us you didn't see anything unusual during this patrol?" "No," Dragon snapped defensively, but the violent crack in his voice betrayed the sheer terror he was hiding. He was trapped in a vice of denial, or protecting a secret far worse than the team could comprehend. Suddenly, the command center radios hissed with a harsh, abrasive static, forcing everyone to turn toward the speakers simultaneously. A voice whispered through the interference, broken, distant, and impossible to pinpoint. At first, it sounded like random atmospheric noise or radio bounce, but then it became unmistakably crystal clear. Despite the heavy layer of static, it formed a single, terrifying word. Brian. The entire team immediately looked at Dragon. That was his real name, his birth name. A name that only a small handful of people in his entire life ever used. Everyone on the ranch knew him exclusively as Dragon. The radio crackled again, louder this time. The whisper stretched and distorted, taking on an unnatural, almost mocking quality as it repeated his name slowly, drawing out the syllables like a cold wind. Dragon stood completely frozen, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the control desk to steady himself. "That's not normal interference," Travis said quietly, voicing the stark reality gripping the room. Dragon didn't answer. He couldn't answer. He just stared at the radio speaker, breathing hard through clenched teeth, looking like he was holding back a tidal wave of rage and panic. Then, the whisper returned one final time, clearer than before, causing every single hair on the back of Dragon's neck to visibly stand up as it delivered two words that would haunt him forever. "Behind you." Dragon spun around so violently and so fast that he knocked over an expensive equipment chair, sending it crashing heavily to the floor. Nothing was there. The space behind him was completely empty. But at the precise millisecond he turned, the entire command center's temperature plummeted at least 20 degrees in seconds. The team's breath instantly became visible in the air. The monitoring cameras flickered erratically, tearing the digital feed, and then the same silhouette from the frozen footage appeared again, but this time on a live feed broadcasting in real time, standing in the exact spot where Dragon had been positioned just seconds before. When Dragon saw his own image on the screen with that thing looming where he'd just been standing, he whispered something that absolutely no one on the crew had ever heard from him in all their years working together. "I'm done." And for the first time in the recorded history of the show, Dragon turned his back on the monitors and walked straight out of the command center, completely abandoning the security lockdown protocol. He didn't return to his quarters that night. He stayed outside alone, a solitary figure pacing the dirt road toward the main gate. Every few minutes he would stop, turn sharply, and stare into the tree line like he expected something to step out of the shadows. The team watched anxiously from the monitors, unsure whether it was even safe to intervene. By sunrise, Dragon was sitting on his truck's tailgate. His shoulders slumped as he stared blankly at the ground. When Travis approached him, Dragon didn't look up. "It's not the ranch," he muttered, his voice hollow. "It's me," Travis frowned. "What does that mean?" Dragon took a long, heavy breath. "This place doesn't just follow you, it chooses you. And something out there chose me a long time ago." He finally explained that before the show ever aired, and right after Brandon Fugal had first bought the ranch, something had appeared to him on the West Ridge, a shimmering distortion that moved without a single sound. He had been so shaken that he never filed a report, never told anyone, and never mentioned it on camera. "It watched me," he whispered, "like it already knew everything about me. And now it's back. It's following me again." The team listened in stunned, absolute silence. When the crew prepared for the next phase of the investigation later that afternoon, Dragon didn't suit up. He walked slowly over to Brandon's truck, dropped his official security badge firmly on the hood, and said only one sentence. "If I stay here, it won't stop." He climbed into his truck and drove toward the gate. The production cameras caught, One final shot in his side view mirror. His face was pale, his expression broken, and his eyes were rigidly fixed on the disappearing silhouette of the Mesa behind him. 1 week after Dragon drove off Skinwalker Ranch for the final time, Brandon Fugal quietly confirmed what everyone already suspected. Dragon had officially stepped away for good. There was no contract dispute, no salary negotiation, and no creative differences. He left because whatever lived beneath that cursed ground wasn't just observing him anymore. It had learned his name, marked his psyche, and proved that the line between the guard and the guarded had finally been erased. The immediate aftermath of Dragon's departure left the ranch in a state of clinical paranoia. The security team he had built and commanded was suddenly leaderless, facing an intelligence that had just demonstrated it could bypass their most advanced physical and digital defenses at will. Brandon Fugal immediately ordered a comprehensive audit of the entire security grid. Every camera, every motion sensor, and every server log that Dragon had accessed in his final weeks was subjected to deep digital forensics. Tech teams worked around the clock, trying to locate the heavily encrypted files Dragon had hidden under his personal credentials. What they found only deepened the dread. The files weren't just encrypted, they were structurally bound to the system in a way that threatened a complete network collapse if forced open. It was as if the phenomenon itself had assisted in hiding the data, using Dragon's login as a digital camouflage. Meanwhile, the physical environment of the ranch seemed to react to the absence of its longtime protector. The remaining guards reported a profound shift in the atmosphere near Sector C and the old cottonwood tree. The localized temperature drops, which had previously occurred erratically, began to stabilize into a predictable, chilling pattern. It was as if a specific frequency had been left running, a lingering echo of the confrontation that had broken Dragon's resolve. Dr. Travis Taylor and the scientific team were forced to completely abandon their previous containment models. For years, they had operated under the hypothesis that the ranch's anomalies were triggered primarily by human activity, specifically transient electromagnetic stimuli like rockets, drilling, or high-frequency radio transmissions. Dragon's psychological unraveling shattered that theory. The data proved that the phenomenon was capable of tracking internal human biochemistry, responding to spikes in human cortisol and adrenaline down to the exact millisecond. The investigation moved from an environmental study to a cognitive interaction study. The team realized they were not conducting an experiment on a piece of land. They were participating in a two-way psychological exchange with a sentient, subsurface presence. The psychological toll on the remaining crew members was immediate. The realization that the phenomenon could isolate a single individual, uncover their birth name, and project personalized apparitions on real-time live feeds triggered a wave of intense hypervigilance. Crew members stopped walking the perimeter alone. The command trailer, once considered the absolute safe haven on the property, was now viewed with deep suspicion. Every flicker of a monitor, every burst of radio static, and every sudden drop in temperature was no longer just an anomaly to be logged. It was a potential message. The question hanging over every researcher, guard, and camera operator was no longer, what is this place? But rather, who is it going to look at next? Dragon had spent years building a wall between the team and the unknown. And with that wall gone, the team stood entirely exposed to whatever was waiting on the other side of the boundary. Dark. The echoing silence that followed his final phone call settled over the remaining team like a physical weight. Back on the property, the vacancy left by his departure became an open vulnerability. For years, his presence had been the baseline of their defensive strategy, a cynical but necessary counterweight to the scientists' drive to probe deeper into the unknown. Without him, the daily routines felt unanchored. The gates were locked and the sensors remained active, but the psychological buffer between the research team and the entity had been completely stripped away. Every automated alert that pinged in the command center now carried an undercurrent of personal threat. When surveillance monitors glitched or the radio frequencies broke into static, the operators no longer just looked for technical explanations or external anomalies. They looked at each other, wondering silently if the system was beginning to log their own biometric fluctuations, or if the radio was tuning itself to a new name. The physical structures of the ranch, from the dark edges of the West Ridge to the quiet space inside the command trailer, felt less like an observation post and more like a stage waiting for the next act. The data from that final, terrifying night remained locked in the system, a clinical record of a line that had been permanently crossed. The investigation would continue, the drills would eventually go back into the earth, and new security personnel would take their places along the perimeter fence. But everyone who stood in the trailer that night understood the reality of their situation. They were no longer just tracking a phenomenon that existed around them. They were occupying a space that was actively waiting for them to react, fully aware that the boundary they were trying so desperately to protect had already broken down from the inside out.